Good morning. My name is Carlo Martuscelli. I'm a Politico reporter covering healthcare, and you're watching Politico Live. I'm coming to you from the Residence Palace here in Brussels, and we're here today to discuss the upcoming revision of the orphan and pediatrics legislation. It's an opportunity to weigh up both the successes and the failures of current pharmaceutical rules, and an exercise in imagining how to re-engineer the complex system of carrots and sticks that underlies Europe's pharmaceutical system. The revision comes at the same time as a broader rewrite of Europe's pharmaceutical rules, and in many ways, its success will be a bellwether for the larger reform. Is it possible to make some headway in addressing the approximately 95% of rare diseases that aren't currently served by medicines? And can we do this in a way that gives access to all European patients, but without bankrupting our health budgets? We're going to be discussing this and more today. But before we do that, I wanted to discuss some housekeeping rules. First of all, I'd like to thank our partner, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, also known as EFPIA, for making this event possible. And of course, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us online. And we do like to make these events as interactive as possible. So I ask everyone that's watching to participate. You can tweet about it at Live Politico and ask questions through Slido at sli.do using the hashtag RareDiseaseEU. You know who we are. So I will be prioritizing questions where the name and the organization of the person asking is there, just to make it as transparent for viewers and panelists as possible. And you can already share your thoughts by answering the following poll presented by FPIA. The question is, what is the best tool to address the unmet medical needs of rare diseases in pediatric patients via EU regulations? And we'll be discussing the results of the poll at the very end of the panel. But before we get started and dive into the discussion, we'll be hearing some opening remarks from our partner, FPIA, from Natalie Moll, Director General of FPIA. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carlo, and good morning, everybody. It's really exciting to be able to have a discussions at this time on shaking up the two pieces of legislation, one of which I worked on in the late 90s, the orphan drug legislation, because research and development in all new medicines is really important. But for me, in the area of rare diseases, in the area of pediatrics, that's the extreme of everything. It's the extreme complexity of science. Many of these diseases are genetically based. It's the extreme complexity because of the rarity of the patients. There are very few patients. It's difficult to run clinical trials. It's also the extreme of suffering. These are diseases that show up in very early childhood and that can be, are extremely, extremely hard and can lead also to high mortality rates. So if we get it right in orphan drugs, if we get it right in pediatrics, we can then hope to make improvements in many other areas. So this is why this conversation today is so important. Carol, you mentioned it, 95% of these diseases still don't have treatments. We are revising our legislation. So this is really the moment where we need to even further improve the two pieces of legislation of about 20 years ago to make the impossible possible and to find even more solutions for the patients, for their families, and for society as a whole, for our healthcare systems. As you said, we have to make these solutions sustainable over time. So not just for the patients of today, but also for the patients of tomorrow. And as an industry, that's what we do. we look for solutions. And we really want to make sure that our industry in Europe is at the forefront of developing and authorizing the next generation of treatments, and that we deliver at the same time a step change in terms of access, more equitable access for medicines to patients. So how do we do that? Our panelists will discuss it in more detail in a second. We need to look at the existing barriers, be they scientific, regulatory, economic, to the development of medicines, and we also need to look at the barriers and understand exactly the root causes of the delays to access, and then we need to address those specifically. We need to do this in a very clever way because there are many different barriers, and sometimes when you find a solution to one and you don't think about the consequences, it could actually be a barrier to the other. So we have to be very methodical in how we do this. We have to work together with all the stakeholders, with the patient groups, with regulators, with industry, with other interested parties to understand. For example, if I look in the scientific areas, I said this is the extreme. These are genetic-based diseases. These are complicated diseases, comorbidities. So we need to have, if you like, a moonshot mindset, a way of joining forces to understand more deeply what the basis of the disease is, and how to accelerate the translational research that can then lead to cures or treatments, cures at best, or even treatments. And we need to do that step by step. We could, for example, start by setting up European-wide patient registries. That would already facilitate the research base on which we start. And then the last thing I'm going to say is access. All these things are wonderful, treatments are great, but if they don't reach the patients who need them, that's pointless. And this is why in this area, it's also the extreme pace by which we have to act, for me, is also very visible. We cannot afford to let patients wait. These are families with small children. These are extreme sufferings, and we need to look together. What are those barriers to access? And I'm sure this morning they will be discussed, and tackle those together, not in silos, because as I mentioned before, solutions in one area can create a barrier in another area. So we have to be very mindful of that. We have a big responsibility. Today, we're going to be choosing the policy for the next 20 years, because hopefully we don't revise legislation more than every 20 years. And so we really need to make sure we choose the right policy levers to address the right issues, ensuring the right competencies around the table. And we look forward to being part of that conversation, but I'm going to leave it to the panel to take you through much more interesting exchanges. And thank you again for the opportunity of working together on this with you, Carlo, and your colleagues at Politico.
Great. Thank you so much for your remarks, Natalie. I think you hit on a few really important issues that are going to come up during the panel. First of all, just the complexity, the scientific complexity of tackling these diseases, but also the regulatory complexity of the pharmaceutical system, making sure that companies have the right reasons to develop these drugs, making sure that once the drugs are developed, they're able to arrive at the patients across the 27 different member countries of the EU, each with very different budgets, very different ways of approving medicines and getting them into hospitals. And I'm also glad that you mentioned the human aspect, because as a journalist, I do like the kind of big picture approach, looking at how these various parts work together. But we should also keep the people who are affected by this in mind, the patients, whether they're children who don't have access to drugs that maybe adults have access to, and we'll be discussing that, or to the patients who suffer from these diseases that just, we don't have enough data to understand how they work, or, drug companies are finding it difficult to develop medicines for that. And the final thing I wanted to highlight was this moonshot mindset, which I thought was a very nice phrase, and it underscores that although this might seem like maybe we're discussing quite niche and technical subjects, actually, if we are able to tackle these issues, it'll make a huge difference to the patients, to their carers, and to society as a whole. So I think moonshot really is the appropriate phrase to use there. I'd like to introduce our panelists who are joining us here today. We have Olga Solomon, Head of Unit for Medicines Policy Authorization and Monitoring from DG Santé at the European Commission. We have Jean-Christophe Tellier, the Chief Executive Officer of the pharmaceutical company UCB. And we have Gilles Vassal, who is a board member of SIOP, the European Society for Pediatric Oncology. So thanks so much for joining us here today. Before we dive into the discussion on the orphan and pediatric drug legislation, first I wanted to just give the floor to Gilles on a slightly different but a very important topic, which is the current situation in Ukraine. Gilles told me that he has been doing some work with patients in Ukraine. So Gilles, if I can just ask you to tell us what work you're doing in Ukraine at the moment, and then we'll go back to the discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Carlo. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to share with you that the entire pediatric hematology oncology community, with the parents and patients from CCI Europe, is working at the moment to assure that children from Ukraine with cancer, children and adolescents, can have a follow-up of their treatment in a country that they can achieve this follow-up treatment. And I can tell you at the moment, the mobilization that more than 100 children and adolescents with cancer from Ukraine have been already welcomed in several countries, such as Poland, Germany, Italy, France, and others. And one of the most difficult things is to make these children and their family travel to the hospital willing and expecting them to continue that treatment and care. So clearly there is a mobilization daily to assure that each child would be offered to have access to care and treatment in the country in Europe, where they can continue benefiting from the treatment that can save their life with regard to cancer.
Great. Thanks so much for that update, Gilles. Again, as I mentioned at the start, it's great to dive into the nitty-gritty of the regulation, but it's also important to keep in mind the patients and the people who are being affected. And I think you illustrated that very vividly with the situation of the pediatric oncology patients from Ukraine. To start out with, I wanted to begin with a lightning round with just a short question and answer going around the panel. If I could ask that each panelist just keeps their answer to a minute or two, just as a way to kind of start the discussion in a dynamic and lively way. And the question I wanted to ask is, to what extent do you believe that the current pediatric and orphan drug rules need to be changed? Do you think that they just need a little fine-tuning around the edges? Do you think they need a substantial changes, but keeping large core parts of the current rules? Or do you think there should be a total rewrite? I'm going to be a little cheeky and start out by asking Olga. Of course, you're the one who is actually doing the rewrite, so we're all very curious to get your perspective on this, and then we'll go around the table. So Olga, if I can ask you to start.
Yeah. Good morning, first of all, to everyone. Thank you, Carlo. And if I may start, not from the question, but saying that, coming back to the words of Natalie and Gilles, and, you saying that, the regulation, it is a technical tool. It is true, but, to some sounds boring. But, what I wanted to say is that these days, when we're talking about regulation, we're talking about, not the tool, but the effect that it has to the lives of patients, to the lives of children, in this case, patients that they suffer. And, I wanted from the beginning to say that this is, the focus of, our review, and we do not lose ourselves into legal technicalities, but, you are concentrating on the aim of this review. So, you're asking if this will be actually, I was also intrigued by the title of the event, Shake Up of Orphan and Pediatrics. What we are looking to do we're looking into the past of the last 20 years or so to see what it has worked well for the intention of this regulation to actually serve these groups of people, people suffering from rare diseases and children, to see what it worked well, what it was less good, identify the weaknesses and try to find solutions. So I don't like to actually identify or the aim of this revision by saying, break, a change of the rules or total rewriting. I think that, what we're trying to do is to, find, the right solutions from for each problem in a holistic way. And coming back a bit to the words of Natalie, we're trying to do it in a clever way, so that we create more balance in the system rather than creating new problems. Okay.
Great. Okay. Perfect. Thanks for that. Gilles, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Carlo. Following the comment by Olga, clearly the regulations both work very well in many areas, but there are drawbacks. And clearly, it has been identified by the evaluation done by the European Commission in the areas of large unmet medical needs, so like childhood cancers and neonatology. That didn't work very well. And in addition, there are still 95% of rare diseases, especially pediatric diseases, the vast majority of them, with no treatment. So we really need to improve these instruments to provide patients with effective, safe medicine to treat their disease. And one of the issues at the moment is that we need a regulation that would be much more patient-centric, addressing the real unmet medical needs and focusing on this, but also a disease that would use the instrument or reward, incentive, and obligation in a better fit-for-purpose approach. Because at the moment, the regulation both is one size fits all and very late incentive and rewards. Incentive and rewards really to incentivize development, but it is very late. So we believe there is a need change. It's not cosmetic change in the regulation. It's not completely rewriting because there are good regulation, but a clearly significant change to make it patient-centric, fit for purpose in really addressing the remaining unmet needs of patients with rare disease, pediatric patients, and other diseases that are life-threatening in this population.
Great. Okay, Gilles, well, we'll be returning to some of those issues that you mentioned around how to make those changes. But I did want to hear from Jean-Christophe. You are, of course, the one who is responsible for developing these drugs. It's your job to do this. So, it would be great to get your perspective on this.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Carlo, and thank you for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity. And building on what Olga and Gilles just mentioned, I think my first message would be we are starting from a positions of strength. I think the legislations and the incentives have demonstrated in the last 20 years that we have achieved results. If I just take one criteria, in 2000, there was only 8 medicine available for orphan disease, and today it's more than 200, which I think it's really a great improvement. We have 6.3 million of patients who have been now treated because of this environment. So I do feel that there have been some positive outcome for that. Now, I think we need to look at what are the blockers. We need to look at what else needs to be done in order to make sure that we can expand the results of what have been achieved to a broader populations of patients and understand the complexity at the different stage. I think I agree with what Jill mentioned, that the incentive today is from a development standpoint, but we need to understand what is missing also from basic science and translations of science into potential medicine in areas which may be relatively complex. So we are starting from a position of strength. I think the current environment and framework have demonstrated a certain positive outcome, but we need to realize now what next we can do.
Great. Perfect. We'll also be returning to those points. I certainly have questions about to what extent this is a scientific problem and to what extent this is a regulatory problem. But before we dive into that, Olga, I wanted to go back to you. We have, from what the last figure I was told, we have some more than 900 people joining us today. And I imagine that the spectrum of people goes from those who are very, very expert in this to people who, maybe are interested in health policy, but aren't too familiar with the context here. So as just a first question, I wanted to ask you, why did the Commission decide to reopen this legislation? We've been hearing that, for example, we're starting from a position of strength, that there are more orphan drugs than before the rules were put in place. And I think that also holds true for pediatric medicine. So there have been some successes, but there is a feeling maybe that this hasn't... they haven't gone far enough, and that we need to figure out ways to give even more impetus. So can you tell us what has been the successes and what instead has been lacking, and why that's led the Commission to reopen this part of the pharmaceutical rules?
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. Actually, colleagues before mentioned, in which ways the legislation has been successful. When in the inception of this regulation, the reason behind it was the market failure. We didn't have medicines for people with rare diseases, and we didn't have the right medicines or on label for children. So they were successful in creating, momentum, research and development of these medicines. We'll have more medicines. And in the pediatric area as well, so we had also research, and that materialized. But is that enough? No, it was not enough. One of the problems...
Oh, it looks like... Okay, it looks like we have a slight technical problem there, but that's okay. Apologies to the audience for that. Welcome back, everyone. Apologies for that slight technical hitch, but it seems like we're back online and we have our panelists here again. So let me just dive straight into the question that we were on before, which was addressed to Olga, which was just if you could just provide the background for the reason why we're having this update to the orphan and pediatrics legislation.
Okay, thank you, Carlo. I don't know, I was speaking to myself for a long time, so I don't know how much the audience heard, but yeah, with pleasure. Actually, the legislation, when at the inception, it was the main objective, it is to serve the needs of patients with rare diseases and with children, for which at the time there was a market failure and there were no products on the market. So as mentioned before, by the other colleagues, it has been a success in providing actually, medicines, right now, and research in these areas. However, it has not been fully successful because, you mentioned before, 95% of the rare diseases, they do not have a treatment. We know very well, that this is very often related to complex science and development issues. However, we see also through the years that there has been some clustering, of development into areas, where we have already development. So one of the reasons it was, why we need to give, more focus on areas where we have no treatments. The other reason, which also, came very strong, from patients associations, but also, from the European Parliament and the Council in Council conclusions, it is that even for the areas where we have treatments, authorized for the whole EU, we don't have equal access from patients across the EU. We see, a delay very often, in the launch of such products in some member states, sometimes related to, the size or the wealth of the member states. So, and also, in some member states, patients, they would never have a medicine. So this has been one of the biggest issues that came to our attention. We are aware that, access to medicines does not depend only on the regulation. There are many different aspects, some of them depending on national decisions, the organization of the health systems, or decisions about pricing and reimbursement. However, we have been actually, also asked, Council conclusions in 2016, asking the Commission to see, the impact of the existing incentives into, the access of products. Just to make it a bit more specific for the areas of rare diseases, the incentive for the development for an orphan medicine, it is very high. It is 10 years of market exclusivity, which means that, blocks competition from other medicines, unless under certain condition of significant benefit compared to what it exists can enter into the market. But it is a reward which is there for a very good reason, because we want it to reward innovation in these areas. But we have to look critically into the system and see, within the current system of incentives, which is the strongest in the world in Europe, do we have the right focus? Do we need to recalibrate? So that, these are the two main reasons. And the third one, that it was mentioned before, we have seen through the application of the legislation for 20 some years now, there are some inefficiencies into the system, some procedures that, we could actually, optimize in order to have, the best, functioning, system we can.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much for that background, Olga. Before we move on and to a different panelist, I did want to just ask a question from the audience, which is from Gabby Leclerc, who asks, can you confirm that the Commission will come forward with the revision in the fourth quarter of this year? Is that still the timeline we're looking at? And then a related question from an anonymous asker is, what are the next milestones in terms of the consultation and implementation?
Yes. No, thank you, Carlo, for this question. Indeed, it is actually, a very tight timeline, but the revision of the legislation for medicines for rare diseases in children, together with the revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation, it is one of the flagships of the pharmaceutical strategy. So even under a lot of pressure, we are working towards this timeline indeed, for Q4 at the end of the year, for the revision as a package of the general and specific legislation. As regards the next milestones with regard to the orphan and pediatric regulation, we have actually completed a lot, colleagues, in the audience, they will know that we had open public consultation, we had target consultations, through what we call the impact assessment. So, it is a process where we're looking at different alternatives, options, for change. So we had all this consultation, and now we are at the time of finalization with an external contractor of this analysis, which will give us elements to decide in the Commission, which is the best, option to go forward with regard to the revision of this legislation. So this will all happen in the next months, and together, with the drafting of the revision, as I said, with the end of the year.
Perfect. Okay, so we are expecting more an update on this very soon. So, audience, keep your eyes open. We'll be hearing more from the commission shortly. I wanted to go next to Gilles. If I wanted to know if you could just, in a few words, just to further contextualize this, what is the reality of the pharmaceutical market for pediatrics? As in, what are the big issues that you see? I understand that there's a big discrepancy, for example, in the amount of new cancer drugs that are approved for adults versus children. Also, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken here, but that oftentimes doctors are forced to prescribe cancer drugs to children that haven't undergone the clinical trials that you'd ideally want. And this isn't because these drugs don't work, it's just because pharmaceutical companies aren't carrying out these clinical trials. So can you talk to us just briefly? I don't want to get too bogged down into the context, but what are the issues in the realm of pediatrics?
There are two things. The first, we need to accelerate the development of innovative therapies for those children, especially childhood cancer, needing new and effective therapy. Accelerating is something that should be incentivized in the revision of the regulation. And the second point that was highlighted by Olga, new drugs are approved. They should be available for all children across Europe suffering of this disease, the rare childhood cancer or the rare pediatric disease. And these are the two main objectives that really the revision should focus on. And accelerating means, at the moment, there is no incentive to start early the development of a new medicine in children, which is developed in adults. And sometimes the pediatric development of these adult medicine in children start late, even when the drug is approved in adults. So the drug is prescribed off-label by the physician, and then there is a real difficulty to run the clinical trial. So incentivizing early start of pediatric development would be very important.
Gilles, sorry, just on the question of this kind of discrepancy, and encouraging early development. I believe you've used the example of Alk inhibitors before as an example of just showcasing how long it takes for children to get the same drugs that are first approved for adults. Can you just tell us about Alk inhibitors and why that's a good example?
Absolutely. So start early development, but start also the development of the right compounds for children and children with cancer. And this is something that we ask for, which means that per the pediatric regulation, a drug in adults should be considered in children, not on the basis of the disease occurring in adults, but on the science and biology of the pediatric malignancies, which means that a targeted drug for lung cancer should not be waived for pediatric development based on the fact that lung cancer does not exist in children, but should be developed in children if the target of this targeted agent is relevant for the biology, the growth, and metastasis of a pediatric malignancy. And this is very important. Moving from adult condition-driven of the development in children to mechanism of action, which is a science, which is understanding the biology, and identifying which drug could be effective for childhood cancer and should be then developed in children. So it's really making the regulation better fit for purpose to science and not being driven by the condition in adults. Did I answer your question?
You did, yes, you did. And just as for some context for the people watching, when we talk about a waiver here, what we mean is that pharmaceutical companies can be exempt from performing clinical trials for children. Normally they'd be required, but the regulator can decide, okay, the drug you're developing, this isn't a disease that occurs in children, for example, with lung cancer. But in the case of lung cancer, it turns out actually a drug that was developed for lung cancer, even though that's an adult disease, we discovered 10 years later, and the fact that it took 10 years is kind of the problem. Actually, this drug also works in children for other kinds of cancers. And so then it's really about making sure that children are being taken care of when in drug development, and we're not seeing these huge gaps, because 10 years is a long time, and a lot of children maybe suffered needlessly in those 10 years. Well, if we had done the clinical trials sooner, they could have gotten that medicine. But thanks for that.
If I may just, Paolo, just to complement,
sure.
In another example, the regulation says if an industry is developing a drug for Alzheimer's disease, they should not be asked by the regulation to develop in children because there is no Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
And then they get a waiver. Per the regulation, they don't have to develop in children. But if this drug for Alzheimer's disease is relevant for a pediatric disease, then the regulations say you should develop in this disease. That is the mechanism of action concept.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you for that context, Jill. Jean-Christophe, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned briefly at the start, but I wanted to dig into this more, which is we have this statistic of 95% of rare diseases not being addressed by pharmaceuticals. Now, this is a field that UCB works on. You develop drugs for orphan diseases. You understand the business ecosystem and how to think about returns on investment and these issues. I wanted to know, in your opinion, do you see this primarily as a market failure problem, that with the right series of incentives and the right regulation, a company like yours could do a lot more and invest a lot more money into research for these diseases? Or is this largely just a scientific problem? We've kind of discovered the drugs for the easier, quote unquote, orphan diseases, and now we're stuck with the really difficult ones, and it's not really money that's the issue here. So I wanted to get your view on this, because obviously this is going to inform the revision, to what extent this even is a regulatory problem.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. I mean, it's an important question, of course. I mean, first of all, it's a complex one. There's maybe three things that I would like to say here. The first one is it's not because you are searching in certain area that you will find a solution in this area, right? I mean, there is a connections between the complexity of the disease, the ability of understanding the biology, and then to translate this biology and scientific hypothesis into a medicine that could treat patients. So there is first a physiopathology, if I may say, that can explain the focus. I mentioned that today we can say that roughly 30 million of patients suffer from rare disease in Europe. Out of these patients' population, 6.3 million actually are treated. So it depends what kind of criteria you take in your statistic. If you take the numbers of disease, 95% of the disease doesn't have a treatment. But if you take the overall patients' population, the results are a little bit better, even if today 6.3 million out of 30 million, there is still a lot of patients who are left behind, and we need to work upon that. The third element is the connections between the understanding of the target and the mechanism of the treatment. It's true, it needs to get a certain economical outcome to stimulate research in this area. In the current medicines authorized in orphan disease, more than 40% of this medicine are for patients, rare disease with a prevalence of less than 1 per 10,000 patients, when you know that the rare disease is 5 per 10,000. So it's not that we are just focusing on the population, the bigger population. There are diseases with a lower incidence and prevalence who have also been treated. So there is an element of how can the science and the ability to understand the target and the biology play a role. But it's also true that for the ultra-rare disease, the disease where there is very limited numbers of patients, It's a much more complex case to solve. It's a much more complex case to solve because we probably need more basic science to understand such of this disease. We need to define targets which could be druggable. And we will need probably to define an environment that would allow research, development, and then access to these patients' population. So I'm sorry, there is not a binary answer to your question, but I hope I have clarified some of these elements that you mentioned.
No, yeah, absolutely. And, as you're speaking, I immediately thought of Natalie's point of just the complexity of it and these trade-offs, between the very low patient numbers and very expensive drugs and how to make sure that everything aligns there. I wanted to go back to Olga just because I need to ask this question. I know it's a question that the audience is wondering about. We have Marcin Rodzinka Varela from IFA. He is asking what can be done to avoid further orphanization. In 2018, 22 out of 99 drugs approved were orphans, and filling this gap has become a lucrative business. Generally, we can maybe restate the point as saying, in this upcoming revision, is that I believe it's 5 out of 10,000, the eligibility criteria, is that on the table for discussion? Are you looking at, do you feel like maybe that this criteria isn't quite capturing what we mean in practice with orphan diseases? And I know this is an issue that also comes up with personalized medicine with cancer drugs and biomarkers and so on. So.
Yeah, thank you. There are two elements, in this question. One, it is, the last one, starting by your last one about how do we define, the criterion for, defining a rare disease or medicines for rare diseases. So, this is threshold, which is now currently, expressed as the prevalence, so the total number of cases, of disease at a specific time. So there's no number of 5 to 10,000. We are looking indeed, to see, if this is a prevalence criterion that, it is still valid. We are looking also, into, different expression, about, because, we know that there are some lifelong diseases, where prevalence probably it is, less suitable criterion, and, we're looking into the element of incidence, for example, how many cases, people you have acquiring this disease within, a period, a specific period of time. These are a bit technical issues, that, we are looking at, there is no decision yet, whether we will change or not, but indeed into the impact assessment, we are looking into, how defining a rare disease. However, another, to the question, about the orphanization of the market, we looked into, the legislation, how, the incentives and these developments, you mentioned also biomarkers affect, the market exclusivity of certain products, and this question, is it true, for example, that, we have, lucrative, market there? It is true that, sometimes we're talking about, the orphan blockbusters, so we are looking to see how the incentives worked, have they been, used appropriately? Did we see, an evergreening, for example, with second indication, etc. So we are looking also what will be the effect of new methods, for example, the use of biomarkers or personalized medicine. And what we want to see is, on one hand, we want to actually have more use of science, more use of this, tools in order, to have more targeted treatments for patients where they need them to avoid, side effects. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we do not have an artificial slicing of, as we call it, salami slicing of diseases, so that it is more driven by market consideration than real patient needs. So all these are, issues that, we are trying to address. The evaluation didn't see, an extreme, abuse of this, system, but still, it is about 10%. So we're trying to find, mechanism to learn from the past and, calibrate the system to avoid, abuse or, unintended effects, if you would like, of the regulation.
Okay, interesting. So it seems like calibration is the operative word here, not a rewrite of the prevalence criteria, maybe in this instance, though, a tweaking to make sure that, we're capturing what we want to capture. We're avoiding this salami slicing while still, benefiting from biomarkers, which I think have shown their use in the world of pharmaceuticals. I'd like to introduce our fishbowl panelist, Virginie Evert from Eurordis. Virginie will be stepping in briefly in the discussion just to kind of give us her view. You're, of course, from Eurordis, the rare disease patient group. So who more appropriate to have with us today to comment on the discussion so far. So Virginie, the floor is yours. First, I just want to ask you, what are your general impressions? Is there something we're missing that you think is really important and that needs to be touched on?
Thank you. Good morning, Carlo. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the invitation. So I would like to share with you some remarks from the perspective of the community of the 30 million of people living with rare diseases. And this includes as well reflection that I gathered from my involvement at the EMA for the past 7 years in the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products, also as the member of the Pharmacovigilance Committee, and working with the other patient representative on the scientific committee. So the first thing is as it has been said this morning already, but from the perspective of the patient living with rare disease, there is no doubt that the two regulations have been beneficial, and even more so when we consider that there are roughly 70% of rare diseases that have a pediatric onset. So that's the first point. Now we also, and it was also mentioned a bit this morning, we can see that some rare diseases have benefited from those regulations more than others. There are some diseases that are now what is called crowded areas with several products. And this is bringing challenges in the assessment of the significant benefit, for example, which is one of the criteria in the current legislation. But however, it does not mean necessarily that there are no more unmet medical needs associated with those diseases. So I think that's also important to keep that in mind. Then when we look at the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of diseases that are yet completely disregarded. It was also mentioned that it was linked to different reasons, complexity of the science, and etc. But also when we have to look at this disregarded diseases, they are disregarded not only from a development point of view, but they are also disregarded from a research point of view, knowledge generation point of view. So that is probably something very specific to tackle. And then in between those two extremes, there is the intermediary segment of rare diseases, which is probably the one that will benefit the most from this revamping of the regulation. And that is where the reflection around the modulation of incentive come into play as well, depending on the characteristic of the disease, depending on the innovative approach that is taken for developing a product for this type of diseases. And it's also what brings me actually to my third and last point on pushing for a more holistic approach to therapeutic development. So let me just explain. For us, the central question here is why not considering that a seamless European process for therapeutic development could be seen as an incentive in itself. So what we propose at Eurordis is really to set up an orphan drug development plan where the interaction between the developers and between the regulators will start early, and will continue up until after the marketing authorization. And not only will be involved the regulators, but also the HTA bodies and the payers. So by seamless process, what we mean is better use of the current expertise, the existing mechanism. For example, strengthening the role of the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products and the expert of this committee. Also building on protocol assistance, getting inspired by the PRIME scheme, the Priority Medicine scheme as well. So these are all elements that we already have in the EU regulation, but also going a bit further. So the example I wanted to mention is that the UK has put in place such a, what we call so seamless scheme that is named ILAP, which is standing for Innovative Licensing and Access Pathways. And this is a scheme that is really bringing collaboration between the Medicine Agency, the MHRA, but also with NICE, with SMC in Scotland, so all the different actors. So, of course, we are in a different situation in the EU, but what we think at Eurodis is that if we really want Europe to remain attractive for developers, if we want also the innovation to reach the patient, and at the same time, as also was said by the other panelists, to ensure the sustainability of the healthcare system, then we need additional elements. So, and I'm going just to mention those two elements that we have identified. One will be EU fund for the generation of real-world evidence that will be primarily used in the case of very rare diseases, complex treatment, and the aim of this fund will be to help reducing the uncertainty at the time of marketing authorization, and therefore to help the decision making when it comes to pricing. And the second element that we are proposing is a table of negotiation that will be based on the experience that we've had in the field of rare disease with initiatives such as Beneluxa, for example, or what we have seen with joint procurement for the COVID vaccine. So this is the two things I want to leave on the table now. These two flagship initiatives, the EU fund and the table of negotiation, they have been identified when we had conducted the rare disease, the Rare 2030, foresight study that was held with 200 experts in the field of rare disease. And that was really one of the main outcomes to identify key areas that will benefit for stronger cooperation between member states.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Virginie. It's a very timely reminder that you know, the problems of orphan and pediatric drug development is inevitably going to go beyond any changes to the legislation, and it's something that other parts of the Commission and the EU for Health program as a whole will need to also address. So, you know, your point about it being holistic is very well taken, and I would like to have Olga also respond to that. But before we do that, I did want to go back to Jean-Christophe quickly, just because you know, in this legislation is coming at the same time as the broader rewrite of the general pharmaceutical legislation, which was set out in the pharmaceutical strategy. One of the aims of the pharmaceutical strategy is to create a thriving and strong European biopharmaceutical sector. UCB is a pharmaceutical company that makes billions of euros of revenue yearly. You're listed in Europe, I saw, and not in the US. So in a way, you're kind of an example of what the Commission wants to foster, the kind of companies that, you know, I think European policymakers want to proliferate. So Jean-Christophe, from your point of view, you know, you're running a business and businesses need a certain amount of certainty, of regularity. What don't you want to see changed? What would be a mistake, in your opinion, to change, and you know, that would affect your bottom line in a negative way without serving European patients?
Well, you're right, Carlo. It's important to put this into a global context of the pharmaceutical strategy and to realize how much pharma as an industry is vital for Europe. If I want to highlight one element, the question is not so much if innovations will happen in the future. The question is where innovations will happen. And there is a risk that innovation is leaving Europe. So I think it's very important for the Commission and the member states to create an environment that continue to protect innovation and stimulate innovation. If I just want to give you one example or illustrations of that, in the last 5 years between 14 and 18, almost 50% of the product that have been put on the market came from the US, and 22% only came from Europe. If you look at the numbers 20 years ago, it was the opposite. So you have seen that with the evolution of science, with the evolution of the environment, we are at risk in Europe to see the innovations leaving. And it's important because an industry like the pharma industry is a knowledge industry. It's an area that have a lot of jobs created, direct and indirect. It's an intensive research and development industry. So it's important that there is investment in research and development that's done in Europe and will continue to do so. And there is a competition from China and from Asia. So there is an overall ecosystem. I mean, pharma contributing trade for Europe more than 150 billion. So it's a wonderful industry, connecting science with clinic, with patients, creating jobs, creating wealth for Europe as such. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this perspective, because very often we are looking at the pharma industry from the lens of affordability, but it's much bigger than that. So I'm really pleased, and I really would like and appreciate that Europe continue to embrace this industry globally, and we look at what value we can create for society. And we have seen during the pandemic that without research, without innovation, the society can have a dramatic impact. So it's really important to continue to nurture that in the future.
Great. That's that point is very well taken, Jean-Christophe. I wanted to give the floor right at the end of this discussion to Olga, both to answer Virginie's call for a more holistic approach, an approach that goes beyond just the legislation, and also Jean-Christophe's point of this international competition that Europe finds itself in inevitably. Olga, how do you think of the international context here, and how do you think of the Commission's role in ensuring that Europe has a robust industry for companies that focus on orphan drugs, but just for the sector as a whole as well?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that, I would agree totally with Jean-Christophe that, this is actually a field, where we are operating in a global environment. And it is one of the objectives also of the strategy and of this revision to keep the competitiveness of the EU industry, but create also, incentives of research and development. I think that, I would say a few things, just to remind that, we in the EU have one of the strongest, actually, incentives system in the world. Just to compare with the US, we have the strongest system of incentives for orphans than the US has. So, one element is this, and we must, we are looking into why, we have this, imbalance created, or this change of trend, if you would like. We have studied a lot, and of course, there are different, aspects that come into this defining, these trends. And it's not only the regulation, it is actually policies about research funding, national policies of tax innovation, etc. But this is, actually, and it is very right that this is a full ecosystem. And this is actually the reason why within the pharmaceutical strategy, we want to create this holistic approach. You mentioned about policies, the pharmaceutical strategy, it is coherent, also with the industrial strategy in Europe, other initiatives of this nature. So, what, we want to do, it is, and it is one of the objectives, it is to actually, keep a healthy system of incentives, but at the same time, we cannot neglect other aspects, like, we said, access, because for us, and starting and finishing from the point that we started, for the patient, I think, innovation from the business perspective and all this, it is crucial, but, we need also to make our system deliver for patients in the end, because, that's what innovation in this sector is about. So just, to recapitulate on that, the global element, it is very important. And also, when I was speaking about optimization of our system, it is also, in terms of, making our system more attractive, more performant, and more competitive, if you would like. And this brings me actually, to the point of also Virginie before. As Virginie mentioned, we have already mechanisms facilitating actually the development, the scientific support of companies, for these areas of medicines, for rare diseases. And we are going to actually strengthen even more, these elements, especially, for small businesses, for startups, etc. Virginie mentioned Prime, for example, and scientific advice, how the committees work, and all these are elements we are looking at. Coming on the holistic approach, I will not, repeat what Virginie said. We have a system, where we have to be respectful of competence and responsibilities of the member states. However, there is also, a clear ambition there to bring together, to facilitate, the cooperation, to have, more exchange and of best practices. Also, we must remember that, we have the new HTA regulation. There is a process of more scientific advice, in parallel between regulators and HTA bodies. What we are looking also, it is to actually enhance also, this cooperation within the revision of the pharma legislation between the different decision actors, but recognizing that, each of the actors have a specific role. So we are looking more into mechanisms of cooperation for more understanding of the needs of each other, alignment of evidence where possible, and collaboration in this respect, which we actually, hope that it will have an effect, in the next decision, and more alignment, more of this holistic approach. I think that, here I will stop, Carlo, and I hope I have replied to the question.
You have definitely. I was told, we had a bit of extra time added on for the technical problems, but we are at the end of the discussion. But however, I did want to just go over the. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, may I interrupt you?
Absolutely.
Allow me to make a short comment as well, very short.
Yes, I was actually gonna just pass it on to you next.
Excellent.
Okay, yeah, Gilles, please, a short comment, and then we'll go over the poll and we'll wrap it up.
I appreciate it. It was the interactive way of thinking of it. Regarding the comment by Virginie about holistic, seamless approach, we fully support. We strongly believe it will be also important to engage with academia, clinicians, researchers, and with parents, patient advocates, because we strongly believe that the only way forward is through a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is what we are pushing in Accelerate. Second, regarding the global revision of the regulations, we think that it should be more patient-centric, science-driven, with better fit for purpose, reward, incentives, and obligations in a way that would address also an approach that drugs approved should be available, accessible, affordable for all children across Europe in a timely fashion. These were the two comments I wanted to make at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles. We have reached the end of our discussion. It's been really interesting. Apologies again for the little technical snafu we had midway through the discussion. But before we wrapped up, I did want to just very quickly go over the results of the poll. The question was, what is the best tools to address the unmet medical needs of rare disease and pediatric patients via EU regulations? And I'm sure it won't be to anyone's surprise that 43% of respondents said that the best way was to improve incentives. And there is a reason why a lot of our discussion focused on incentives today. That is, of course, one of the main levers to rejig the system. 28% did talk about fostering the R&D ecosystem to increase the scale and scope of basic research. And I think that goes to Virginie's point about creating, for example, funds for these ultra-rare diseases. It's a way of overcoming these market failures. 20% said enhance the flexibility, predictability, and speed of the regulatory framework. I guess this goes to that access point. You know, you can develop a drug, but then if the drug doesn't reach certain member countries, except for much later than others, well, that's a problem. And finally, 9% said increase access to existing treatments. And of course, that's always an issue, and we didn't really get into it so much, but you know, we're seeing, for example, the spread, the increase of gene and cell therapies, for example, as an avenue to address rare diseases, and those are very, very expensive, and they're quite difficult for health systems to integrate in their current functioning. I'm sure we'll see changes going forward, but that is the case for now. So I want to thank the panelists for joining me today, for kindly giving me so much of their time. I want to thank everyone who watched. I want to thank FPIA again for sponsoring the panel. And I do ask the audience to please send their feedback to live@politico.eu and also to check our website for updates. We have a great events lineup this year. That is politico.eu/events. Thank you once again, everyone, and a great discussion.